She was refilling a coffee cup when it happened. Her hand was steady, the way it always was, the way 10 years of practice and survival had made it. And the morning light was coming through the window of Pine Creek Cafe in soft golden sheets, the way it did every October in that quiet corner of rural Montana. The cafe smelled of bacon grease and maple syrup and old wood, and the handful of regulars sat in their usual seats, reading their usual newspapers and complaining about the usual weather, and everything was ordinary, and everything was safe, and she had told herself that same thing every morning for 10 years, until she almost believed it. She had learned to love the quiet. She had learned to survive inside it. And then the bell above the door rang, and a man walked in, and behind him, on a short leash, walked a Belgian Malinois with amber eyes that swept the room the way a searchlight sweeps a dark field, slow, deliberate, and missing nothing. Her hand stopped moving. The coffee overflowed the cup by just a little. She set the pot down on the counter with great care and did not look up, because she had learned across 10 years in 7 different towns that you never look up too quickly. Calm was armor. Calm was survival. She smoothed her apron with both hands and turned toward the new customers with the practiced smile of a woman who had been serving strangers since she could no longer afford to be known by anyone at all. The man was in his late 50s, silver-haired, straight-backed, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent years in places where stillness was the difference between life and death. He wore civilian clothes, but carried himself in the unmistakable way of a military officer, not with arrogance, but with a settled, deliberate gravity that filled whatever room he entered. He chose a booth near the window, sat down, and placed his hands flat on the table. The dog moved beside him and then stopped. It raised its broad, angular head. Its amber eyes found her across the cafe floor, and then, without a word from its handler, without any signal or command, the dog stood, turned away from the table, and walked directly toward her. It walked with quiet, absolute certainty, the way trained dogs walk when they have found exactly what they came to find. It reached her feet, sat down, pressed its warm side against her legs, and did not move. Old Jim Hartley looked up from his crossword at the counter and said, "Well, that's a friendly one." And then he went back to his puzzle, because in Pine Creek, Montana, a dog sitting at the waitress's feet was not the strangest thing anyone had ever seen. But it was the strangest thing that had happened to the woman they knew as Marie in 10 years, because 10 years ago she was someone else entirely. Her real name was Emma, Lieutenant Emma Carter, United States Navy Intelligence. And that dog, pressing its warm weight against her legs as if it had been searching across an entire decade of silence to find this exact moment, that dog had once been her partner. Her voice came out barely above a breath. "Shadow," she whispered. She had not said that name in 10 years.
She had not allowed herself to say it, the way you do not allow yourself to say the name of something you have lost, because saying it out loud makes the loss too real and too present and too impossible to carry. But the dog heard her. Shadow's ears moved forward. He pressed harder against her legs, and something broke open in her chest that she had spent 10 years carefully keeping sealed. She remembered the night she had first been assigned Shadow. A cold February morning at the naval facility in Virginia, the dog sitting in a wire kennel with those same amber eyes watching her approach with patient, measuring calm. She had knelt down and put her fingers through the wire, and he had sniffed her hand slowly, and then licked it once, deliberately, as if he had made a decision. Her supervisor had laughed and said, "Looks like he chose you." She had not understood then how true that was. She had not understood that a dog's loyalty, once given, does not have an expiration date. She had been 29 years old when the world ended the first time. She had been stationed at a classified naval intelligence facility in Virginia, embedded in an operation so sensitive that her own family believed she pushed papers and filed routine reports. What she actually did, alongside Shadow, was track. She followed the invisible threads of information that moved between people who were not supposed to know each other, and she followed those threads with Shadow at her side until they led somewhere they were never supposed to lead. And one night in November, 11 years ago, those threads led her to a name that made her go cold. The name belonged to a senior Navy commander, a decorated officer, a man who had served 30 years and had the kind of reputation that ended investigations before they could begin. And he was selling classified intelligence to people who used it to put American service members in danger. Emma had done everything right. She had documented everything with precision, with care, with the particular devotion of someone who understood that the truth, once built correctly, should be able to stand on its own. She had submitted her case through proper channels, with Shadow asleep under her desk and her hands steady on the keyboard. 3 weeks later, she had been called into an office by men she did not recognize, and they had placed a file in front of her that accused her of fabricating evidence, of conducting unauthorized surveillance, of compromising classified systems. The charges were detailed. They had her name on every page, and she understood with the cold clarity that comes only when the ground disappears beneath you, that the commander she had exposed had powerful friends.
And those friends had moved faster than she had, and the truth she had built so carefully had been turned around and aimed directly at her. The morning they came for Shadow was the morning she decided to run. They had taken him without ceremony, just 2 men in uniform arriving at the facility and walking out with her dog on a leash while she stood in the corridor and watched, and was not permitted to say goodbye. She had stood there until they turned the corner and Shadow disappeared from her sight, and something in her had gone permanently quiet after that. She had packed a bag that same night. She had driven through the dark with a name she had chosen from the side of a building in a town she passed through at 2 in the morning. Marie. Simple. Forgettable. The name of a woman with no past and no rank, no story worth investigating. She thought about her mother every single day. Her mother lived in a small house in Columbus, Ohio, with a garden that bloomed every spring with the yellow tulips she planted faithfully, regardless of the weather. Emma had not called her in 10 years. She could picture her mother sitting at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings, with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, looking out the window at the yard, lighting a candle at the little church on Maple Street every week, the way Emma later learned she did. She could picture her mother's face the last time she had seen it, at Thanksgiving 11 years ago, her mother squeezing her hand at the door and saying, "You look tired, baby. You're working too hard." Emma had said she was fine. She had said she would call soon. She had not known that it was goodbye. A mother should not have to spend 10 years not knowing if her child is alive, and Emma carried that guilt the way she carried everything else, silently in the early hours of the morning when the cafe was empty and the chairs were still upside down on the tables and there was no one to perform steadiness for. The man from the booth had crossed the cafe floor quietly and was standing 3 feet away with a manila folder in his hand. "Lieutenant Carter," he said softly. She did not reach for a denial. She was too tired. She had been too tired for a long time. "My name is Rear Admiral Thomas Hale, retired. I have been looking for you for 3 years. He set the folder on the counter. "The charges against you were formally cleared 37 months ago. Commander Briggs gave a full deposition before he died. Everything you reported, every thread you followed, every document you filed, it was all corroborated.
Your record was expunged. Your rank was restored. You have been a cleared officer for over 3 years, Emma." He paused. His voice dropped just slightly. "We just could not find you." 3 years, she said. The words came out slowly, like something being lifted from deep water. It was cleared 3 years ago? He nodded. She looked at the folder on the counter and did not touch it for a long moment. Danny, behind the register, was pretending to wipe the counter. Jim Hartley had set his crossword down. Patty Morse at the far booth had taken her reading glasses off her head. The whole cafe had gone the particular kind of quiet that happens when something important is occurring, and everyone can feel it, but no one can name it. "How did you find me?" Emma asked. The Admiral looked down at Shadow and then back at her. "We didn't," he said simply. "He did." She opened the folder. Her photograph was paper-clipped to the top. Her real photograph, Lieutenant Emma Carter, 29 years old, in her dress uniform, with a career and a purpose and a name that was hers. She turned to the deposition. Commander Briggs had told the truth in the final months of his life, had named the men who helped him, had described in precise and damning detail how a young lieutenant's courage had been buried beneath a mountain of fabricated charges. And in the last paragraph of the deposition, the paragraph she read twice with her eyes moving slowly over every word, he had written that Lieutenant Emma Carter had been right about everything, that her instincts had saved lives that would have otherwise been lost, and that the only person who should have carried the weight of what happened was the man who caused it. She sat with that paragraph for a long time. The cafe was so quiet she could hear the October wind moving against the window glass. She closed the folder. She looked at Danny, who was 26 years old and given her this job without asking too many questions, who called her Marie with a warmth that always felt genuine and unearned. She looked at Jim Hartley with his decaf and his crossword. She looked at Patty Morse, who had once brought her a casserole during a bad winter week without being asked. These people had not known who she was. They had been kind to her anyway. The uncomplicated, unguarded kindness of small American towns that hold strangers without knowing it, that offer warmth without requiring explanation. She had not deserved it, and she had needed it, and she was grateful for it in a way she would spend the rest of her life trying to properly articulate. She reached down and placed her hand on Shadow. He leaned into it with his whole body. He had been waiting 10 years for that, or perhaps only the long hours of that particular morning, which is sometimes the same thing. "You found me," she said to him very softly. "You stubborn, beautiful dog. You actually found me." She stood slowly, the way a person stands when they are setting down something they have carried for a very long time. She untied her apron. She folded it carefully on the counter. She walked to Danny and she said, "You run a good place. Don't ever let that change." His eyes were bright and a little confused, and he nodded without speaking. She stopped at Jim Hartley's stool and put her hand briefly on his shoulder. He patted her hand once without looking up from his crossword, the gesture of a man who understands that some goodbyes do not need explanation. She walked out of Pine Creek Cafe on a Tuesday morning in October with a manila folder under her arm and Shadow walking steadily at her left side, exactly where he had always walked, exactly where he belonged. The mountain air hit her face, and the sky was the particular blue that only Montana gets in autumn. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed it in, and thought about her mother sitting at a table in Columbus, Ohio with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, looking out at yellow tulips. She thought about the phone call she was going to make before the day was over. She thought about how her mother's voice would sound when she heard her name. She thought about all the Sunday candles lit in a small church on Maple Street by a woman who refused to stop believing. She was going to make that call. She was going home. Rear Admiral Hales stood beside her and said nothing, because he had enough experience to know which moments required silence, and this was one of them. Shadow pressed against her left leg and looked up at her face with those amber eyes, and she understood, standing there in the October light, what it means to be found. Not by a system or a database or a network of investigators, but by love. The
the specific, patient, unconditional love that does not expire with time or distance or a decade of silence. A military dog had done in 30 seconds what 10 years of official searching could not accomplish. He had walked into a cafe in rural Montana, lifted his head, found the person he had been waiting to find, and sat down at her feet and refused to move. That was all it had taken. That had been enough. She had 37 months to reclaim. She had a name to step back into, and a mother to call, and a sister in Tennessee who thought she was gone, and a life that had been waiting for her, patient as a dog at a door, through all of it. She had been falsely accused and forced to run, and cleared in secret, and lost for a decade, and none of that could be undone. But she was standing in the October sunlight with her name back in her hands, and the dog who had never stopped being her partner was walking beside her. And somewhere in Columbus, Ohio, a woman was about to hear her daughter's voice for the first time in 10 years. Some things cannot be recovered.
But some things, the ones that matter most, the ones that are built from real love and real loyalty and real truth, those things have a way of finding their way back. Always. Even if it takes 10 years, even if it takes a dog with amber eyes who walks into a Montana diner on an ordinary Tuesday morning and sits down at a waitress's feet and refuses to move until the world finally gets it right. If this story reached something inside you, if Emma's 10 lost years felt familiar in any way, if Shadow's loyalty reminded you of a love you have known, please subscribe to the 11th Hour Last Words. Every week we bring you stories of quiet courage, sacrifice, and the love that outlasts everything that tries to bury it. Hit subscribe, turn on the bell, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Because some stories deserve to be told, and some people deserve to know they are not forgotten. This story honors the invisible sacrifice of military intelligence personnel whose service lives in classified silence. It speaks honestly about institutional injustice and the human cost of false accusation, not in abstract terms, but in the specific texture of 10 lost years. The bond between Emma and Shadow reflects the scientifically documented depth of loyalty in working dogs, and at its heart, this is a story about a mother's faith, the candles lit every Sunday, the refusal to stop believing, which speaks directly and deeply to older American audiences who understand in their bones what it means to wait for someone you love.